today we have a pleasure of welcoming one of our very own PPP experts to us online for this CP3P Executioner course, as well as you guys at home watching and working through this with us, as well as Andre, who took a short break this morning. So I will, without further ado, I will introduce Mr. David Baxter. And thank you so much, David, for being here today with us and agreeing for this. It's a very special day for us. So please, if you don't mind, can you just give us a couple of comments? Who are you? And so that the guys know the big expert that we have today with us. So thank you, David. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone there. Many of you might not know it, but I was born in Cape Town, South Africa. So I feel very at home with this group this morning based in South Africa. I have been involved with public-private partnerships for, I think, a big percentage of my professional career. When I worked at the Human Sciences Research Council in Pretoria, we had a program which was called Human Participation way before people were talking about PPPs, but it involved elements of PPPs, and I led that initiative. I since then moved to the United States. A few years ago, I was the executive director of the Institute for Public-Private Partnerships. Many of you might have heard of it, IP3. Where I then got involved with APMG on their initial efforts at developing the Book of Knowledge or the Books of Knowledge, and also some of the tests. In the interim, or since then, I've also been working as a PPP expert around the world. I think my last count was about 40 countries. So I consider myself a global consultant, but I often call myself a PPP navigator and not a consultant, because I believe that you have to navigate through PPPs. You're not just consulting. And institutions that I've worked for part-time have included the World Bank, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Many of you might have heard it in your country, USAID, and many other organizations. So I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answer some questions and provide some insights into practical experiences and best practices.
Thank you, David, so much. It's a real pleasure and honor to have you today with us, and especially on a day like this, because we are going through one of the hearts of the PPPs, and that's the contract management as well. And the one thing that we have been saying right throughout this course is that the PPPs should, as a contract, be so much so flexible to allow for this win-win situation between the public and the private partner. So if I can just ask you a question on that, so the importance of having flexible contract project management terms for times of disaster, like we are all in it today and now with us. So from the COVID-19 perspective, what are your thoughts on that?
I think, unfortunately, in the past, when force majeure clauses were built into contracts and PPP contracts, in many instances it was almost just an automatic action or a process that people put in because it was required to have a force majeure clause, especially for insurance purposes and risk allocation for the unexpected. But I'm not sure that anyone ever really took them seriously. And I think one of the biggest challenges on contract management is often there's a big divide between the public sector's contract manager and then the private sector's contract manager and team leader. And they don't talk enough. They sometimes hardly ever interact. And as a result of that, I think this was kind of something that was just, swept under the carpet. No one really expected it to happen. Recently, for example, in the United States, I've seen with big contracts with force majeure clauses that they've been talking about along the lines of, well, who's really responsible? This pandemic wasn't designed or described. If you look at many of the clauses, for example, even the World Bank descriptions, they will use different words, pandemic, epidemic. As many lawyers can come up with very clever descriptions for what these things are, they will put that in. And then the result of that is then there's a big debate about, what are we really talking about? Is it a pandemic? Is it an epidemic? And critically, whose fault is it? And I think the biggest thing that for flexibility, as you said, Arena, it's critically important that the mindset is entered to in times of crisis that we don't want the PPP to fail. So we need to sit down and have collaborative discussions on how we can change things or ignore things or adjust things within the framework of the agreement so that the project moves forward. And I think two things need to happen. Public sector needs to listen to the private sector needs to listen to the public sector, but importantly, there needs to be a situation created that if the project company managers are experiencing challenges, they should feel confident enough to bring it to the public sector's attention and not immediately face punitive actions.
100%, David. We have one question, if you don't mind, on the force majeure. I'm not quite sure if you are aware, actually, but Eskom is pulling basically a force majeure on the small IPP sector here due to the shrinkage in demand for the electricity currently because we are all stuck at home. So do you think that perhaps Eskom should be actually doing that, or whether that's not really a good practice? I'm not quite sure. I would think maybe that's not really reasonable, given that we are struggling in normal circumstances with the electricity, and now to create issues would be quite difficult to get out of. Do you perhaps have any other further thoughts on this?
Well, I think if it's a panic reaction or an emotional reaction, that's the wrong way to go. And Eskom needs to ask itself, when we get to the post-COVID-19 period, are we going to have a partner that we can interact with? If you cut them off, you take punitive actions against them, and they fail, then what? I mean, I think everyone on this course knows that when you launch a PPP or an IPP or whatever version of it that you want to refer to, it takes months, if not years, to do the visioning, the planning, the procurement process, etc. This is not something that you can just flip the switch on the next day. And we see that even in the United States with President Trump here, who's saying, I'm creating a mandatory date where I'm just going to switch the economy on and everything's going to be like it was before. It's not going to take place. And I think the biggest challenge, with force majeure is if you cut off organizations and they fail, there's going to be a brain trust flight from that organization, and it's going to be a hollow shell. It's going to have nothing to give back when it needs to be running again.
Great, thank you. So I guess this is nicely tying into sort of my next question about the force majeure and the contract project management for that matter. How can we afford being unnecessarily punitive in this matter?
I was talking to some people in Dubai the other day. One was from the Dubai Airport Authority. And, they were examining force majeure and punitive actions against the operator because, planes aren't landing, things aren't happening. But a contract for a PPP has many activities that need to take place. And the one that's critical is, you get the design, the build, the finance, the operate and maintain, it's a DBFOM type contract typically. But the element that, where you can really focus on is the maintenance time now, or even design and build of new facilities. So instead of focusing on, there's not traffic taking place at the airport, this is a wonderful opportunity when the runways are shut down to do improvements. If you think of a runway improvement plan, where they could operate maybe in a window of 4 or 5 hours a night, and that's it. Imagine now a situation where you can operate 24/7. You could get maintenance done that would have taken months, if not years to do. You could get it done in 3-4 months. And that still means that the contractor or the operator or the concessionaire, however you want to describe them, is still delivering on clauses. So just refocus what they're doing instead of slapping them with a force majeure clause and causing them to shut down because they're not doing everything.
100%, David. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And now when you're also talking about that, what I'm thinking as well, there might be potentially even some sort of a cost savings or efficiencies, even if they've introduced particularly that sort of maintenance and operations portion in this time. So, and that's what we've been actually discussing this morning as well, that there are certain things which can be shown as also opportunistic in the sense that from a monetary point of view, so that the time is saved, the costs are saved as well. And again, it would be a win-win situation. Andre, just to come back to you, I think you had also a couple of questions as well for David. So please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Irina. And David, we really appreciate the time that you've made available. I wanted to ask a question on what is important now before COVID, and what will probably be more important now. It's the long-term sustainability of projects, the resilience. So from a contractual perspective, what would you recommend that one take into account and design some more sort of resilience in our contracts looking forward?
So that's a really important point, and I think I'm glad you brought up the word resilience, because I do think that by bad design, a lot of PPP contracts don't focus on resilience or sustainability. Now, we're facing a situation, I think everyone knows that a large-scale PPP is typically going to be 25 plus, 30 plus years in duration. If you think of that, we don't really know, and unless you're a genius or an extraordinary alien from an outer space, we really don't know what is going to happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So when you set up a 30-year contract, you are making a lot of assumptions that are based on information we don't have. So I think what one needs to do is, build in, how would you call it, general resilience factors, general resilience clauses, etc., that are flexible into contracts, so that when you have these events repeated, you are in a position to have a policy, practice, approach, strategy, or whatever you want to call for it. And if you're listening to the medical practitioners out there, they're saying that COVID-19 is not just going to end very quickly, and there's a big likelihood in the next 5 years, 10 years, there'll be another incident. I think people are so focused on COVID-19 that they're forgetting about the SARS and the MERS outbreak, and those were much more local, but they had the same impact, and it's pity it seems that no one learned lessons. So I would say that you're going to have to come up with strategies and clauses that address, I think everyone's focused on the short term, but what you do well in the short term is what's going to determine how successful your medium and long-term actions are. And I think the medium-term ones are going to be the ones for recovery in the next 6 months, for example, and for the next 2-3 years as projects are recalibrated and everyone moves forward. But you're going to have long-term clauses as well, or strategies that need to be addressed in existing contracts and future contracts that will ensure, as you said, projects are sustainable and resilient.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a mouthful, but I think those are the things we need to give attention to. Then another topic, technology. We know and understand that technology is making a huge impact in the world. It's making huge impact in the management of infrastructure. And if I can use the water sector, and I'm taking the cue from the American Water Association, that sort of keeping track of technology developments, especially in the water space. And the engineers are actually now managing to decrease operational cost in the water space by using technology. How do we accommodate this fast advancement of technologies, and also then the obsolescence of technology? Because obviously what works today may not work in 5 years' time, and yet we enter into 30-year contracts.
Okay.
Any views on that, please?
Yeah, I want to tell a very interesting story. So in the port of the port of New Orleans in the state of Louisiana, in 1917, A contract was signed. It was a PPP between the port and a major coal producer to build a port bunkering facility or refueling facility. And it was signed under a 99-year contract for this facility to provide coal to ships to power them. What happened was, by the time you got to the 1930s, not even 20 years later, most ships were converting to oil or diesel or whatever. They weren't using coal. And the contract had been so strictly and rigidly written that it was enforced for 99 years. The Port of New Orleans had to pay this now defunct coal company a dividend, or not a dividend, a payment each year, an availability payment each year for something that was not going to be used. And so that company survived for 100 years past its survival point because it had a guaranteed revenue stream. This is an extreme example and ridiculous, but that's not uncommon with technology that we use. Just think of landline phones. If you had done a 40-year landline contract 30 years ago when landlines were still prevalent, and now you get to the situation that almost no one uses them, what were you going to do, So the question I think that you need to build in clauses, and this is, where you came up to the idea of obsolescence, is that there are clauses that should be adjusted or be written in a way in sectors where there is rapidly evolving what you call a technology. Talking about the water in the Middle East, these big desalination plants where these filters that desalinize water have gone from being very rudimentary to extremely efficient. It basically has forced operators to introduce new technology, because if they didn't, they would be operating at a tremendous loss. But the one thing that I think is also important is consider, let's say, if a company introduces a new innovation, okay, which is a new technological process, it is important that the public sector does not then make greater demands for sharing, for example, profits that may result from improved technology. Because if a company can introduce new technology and it makes more money, isn't that what you want? You want a secure provider. You want one that's going to provide, innovation, because we always talk about PPPs as being an innovation approach. And then in that case, if you don't, for example, let them take the rewards of the innovations that they introduce and the new technologies that they introduce, you're going to de-incentivize them to doing anything, and they're just going to be a mediocre operator. But there's a very long answer to your question. Just in a short other comment that I'd like to add is, if there are unexpected innovations that radically change the way things operate, like the coal example that I gave, the coal bunkering facility, you need to have clauses that are not punitive, carefully thought out, that can accommodate the unexpected in general terms, because you're never going to be defined it. Because if you try to define it, you are assuming you know what's going to happen.
Thank you. Very interesting. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Andre and David. And if I may just close off our short interview with you today with the last question, but please do stay on the line for a couple of follow-up questions from the audience. So what I will ask you for the final is basically, how do we include people first PPP values in the PPP contract management, and then adapt them to serving the SDGs as well? PPPs, for our audience, it's a fairly recent term that was introduced, I believe, by UN. But yeah, please go ahead if you don't mind. Thank you, David.
I think a situation has occurred in many countries where a lot of PPP projects, unfortunately, have maybe been prestige projects. So I'm talking about, massive sports stadiums that have been done as PPPs. And, they get used maybe once a month, twice a month if you're lucky. And the rest of the time, these facilities are standing, unused. And the result of that is, even though when you have a PPP and the private sector is financing it, there's still often funding commitments from the governments as well. And so we got a sense that, and I was working with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE, they have a PPP Center of Excellence in Geneva, where this idea was surfaced, is that if you are considering PPP projects that are focused as building blocks for development in countries, and you are trying to do development that is driven towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, then you need to include a people element in it. And that's the decision that these projects that we are building, are we building them with the people in mind and the users in mind, or are we just building it because we need them or we think we need them or whatever? So that's the rationale behind that.
100%. Thank you so much, David, for that. I mean, it's really invaluable information as well. So I really do appreciate it. I'm sure that our guests as well, the audience as well, appreciates it. I have a couple of questions coming through. So the first question was, so from your global view and the global perspective, basically, do you think that SA is conducive for international investors?
Can you repeat the last part? Sorry?
So do you think that SA is conducive for international investors? In other words, will there be appetite internationally for investors to invest in SA given the current economic situation?
Yes. I think, whenever there's an enabling environment that attracts investment, it will take place. I think the South African government needs to realize one thing, that investors are not sentimental. So, if you don't create the right situation, you are going to have investors looking elsewhere. So what South Africa needs to do is really create an enabling environment that is attractive. This also means that the public sector entities that are launching PPPs need to become private sector friendly. And I know that's difficult because you hear that in South Africa, that it's privatization, a sellout, and all sorts of things like that, selling off of national assets. As long as there's a government attitude that supports some of these things, you will have a situation that investors will be apprehensive. So, if South Africa can do a good, I would call it a marketing campaign to say, we're here, we're ready, we're interested, we're going to give good terms that are in the interest, and this is really important, of both parties, and we want sustainable, resilient projects, etc. And we are going to support your project. We're not going to nationalize it. We're not going to yank it out from under your feet in 5 years' time when we don't need them anymore. Then I think you have a market.
Great. Thank you for that. Fabulous. And another question is just in general, in your view, would this pandemic be considered as force majeure? What is your general view?
I think it should be, because, if it's a well-structured document, it's going to mention plague, pandemic, or something. But, unfortunately, there's also, the insurance companies that are going to be overstretched. And, they can't, I don't think anyone planned this type of thing. And, for example, in the United States, what we're seeing recently is, under business operation insurance, that many of the insurance companies are saying that this isn't included, because the facility is not damaged, the facility is still there, it's operational, even though you can't get people in. So again, I think the insurance companies that are innovative and offer good products are going to be the ones that people will go to in the future, and those who have a really bad story to tell are going to be avoided, and they might go under. So yeah, it's definitely a force majeure, but it depends on the lawyers, I suppose, and how passionate or compassionate people are, and again, in whose interest they're working in.
Great stuff. And I think finally we have a couple of more minutes. We have received a voice message, which I do hope it is a question, so let's just have a quick listen.
There seems to be a general reluctancy by governments everywhere to jump all into PPPs. My belief is because Africans, governments at least, like to empower their friends through traditional procurement. But my question is, how does one change the mindsets of government, besides the obvious capacity building, and how does one get to a point where we start creating project development project appraisal funds?
Oh, that's a good one. It's sort of the elephant in the china shops question always.
Yeah, just for your information, this question came all the way from Namibia. So yeah, so well done you.
You know, you know, there's no easy answer other than there has to be a mindset change. Are we having politicians that we elect who perform well and do what they say they were going to do? And, if somebody runs on a platform and says, I'm for clean government, then they should be supporting every type of procurement that's competitive and transparent. I think in many countries there is a fundamental philosophical opposition to PPPs. One of the countries that I worked in last year was in Sri Lanka, and the name of the full name of the country is the Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. And they have a history of an experimentation with socialism, pretty much like Tanzania did, for example. And the result of that was that many of the public servants also opposed anything that smacked of privatization. And I think the important things when we're talking about PPPs is the number of things we have to point out. First of all, if they procured competitively and transparently, they're most likely going to be good projects. So that should be a way to combat corruption, especially if you use e-procurement platforms where you take some of the functions away from corrupt officials. The other is, just the sense that PPPs are not privatization. People always say to me, PPPs are privatization, but I say it's a public-private partnership. If you take the public out, it's not a PPP anymore. So, think of that in those terms. And I think, the big thing is also having citizens watchdog groups or independent utility companies, not utility companies, but utility institutions that follow up. I can tell you one thing, though, if African countries or countries anywhere around the world reach out to organizations like the African Development Bank and the World Bank and that, they are going to find it harder and harder to avoid competitive and transparent procurement, because those institutions will do due diligence on the PPP procurement process as well. And if they find out that it's not open, they're not going to they're not going to provide the financing or the funding, whichever side it comes from.
Right, fantastic. Thank you, David, for that. That's really insight into all of this. So thank you. We really appreciate everything and all your input. And just this is the very last one, I promise, before we let you go. So it's a little bit of a long one. So the question is, given that the financial model in PPPs is transparent, and given that there are certain public infrastructure sectors that we know are appropriate for PPPs, such as sustainable revenue stream, might it be possible to have a sector PPP program with an initial procurement of partners based on qualifications and competition are based on expected return on investment, and then have the private partners do the feasibility studies for the individual projects within the program for approval by the owner, a bit like a design and build in conventional procurement. So I guess the whole point of this is, can we get away without the advisors in a way? So can we actually start direct with the private sector from the feasibility study?
I think it's possible. A typical procurement has two steps to it. There's the technical evaluation and then there's the financial evaluation. Usually it's done in a two-envelope process where they look at the technical first, make the decision on the company which is the most or they say the top three which are the most technically competent, and then they will open the financial model and look at and see who gives the most competitive price. I think what you could do, and I'm just shooting from the hip at this stage, if you did it as a two-phase, that maybe you had a very heavy technical phase where let's say you choose your selected partners or your preferred partners, okay, limited to 3, for example, and then get them to do a further feasibility study as part of a submission to the financial model a little later on. So don't do it all in one package, but break it up into 2 phases. And then, based on the feasibility study that they have sponsored, you can do another technical review, and then maybe look at the models. But I think what would happen after the first phase of those, let's say the 3, is that it would be good, based on information gathered from all 3 parties, to look at the RFQ and call it RFP 2, and adjust it accordingly to new insights and new information you've done, so that a adequate feasibility study can be done. And what you can do often is that they do it is, you could charge a fee for each of those parties to pay, which will subsidize the what you call the feasibility study. And then the party that wins eventually, once a good model has been determined and the project has been determined to be commercially and economically viable, the winning party recompensates the losing parties for their contribution to the feasibility study. So I don't know if that would work, but that's something that I would consider.
Certainly, it's an idea. I mean, well done. So I was just going to ask about the sunken costs as well, but you answered that very well in the last section. So thank you so much, David. So I really appreciate all your time that you have given us today. Thank you.